Now, African states spend about 35 billion US dollars a year importing food that could be grown right here on the continent. If nothing is done to reverse this mass export of capital and jobs by 2030, this figure could rise to $100 billion a year. Now, earlier, CCTV's Ramah Nyang spoke to the president of the African Development Bank, and he explains why fixing agriculture output is vital for job creation, poverty eradication, and of course the future of monetary policy.
65% of the consumer price index in Africa is food. And all the central bank governor is trying to do is to actually rein down inflation, right? Well, if you produce a lot of food, you actually rein down that inflation. It makes it easier for a central bank governor. Secondly, is that it creates massive amount of jobs all over the rural economies. It would be really great to be able to do that. The third is that it also saves you so much foreign exchange. Instead of spending all of $35 billion a year importing food, you'll be saving that money, which is actually good in terms of macroeconomic and fiscal stabilization.
Land reform, access to markets, and the quality of the trade deals that we strike within Africa and with our exporting markets, those are two extremely important issues when it comes to unlocking the potential in agriculture. And land tends to be an extremely emotive issue right across sub-Saharan Africa. What's the bank doing on that?
And we have land that is assets, is sitting there, is not being unlocked. And that is what needs to change. A lot of it is communal lands. As part of it is customary land rights. And I think what is important is to create a more modern agricultural sector that will allow those smallholder farmers to be able to produce, have access to productivity enhancing technologies, produce, have a surplus, feed themselves, have a lot more, and be able to export and have people that will provide markets for them. Nobody wants to be poor, right? But if you create the enabling environment, I think that we can lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But the land situation will need to be addressed.
And that's a question of what? Land laws, land policies?
And I think some of it is already happening in some countries. I take a look at Ethiopia. It's doing a very good job in terms of how it manages its land registration and also land titling. Rwanda is probably the one that's gone furthest in Africa. They've actually registered all the lands in parcels of land in Rwanda, and they have a digital database of that. Ghana is also following in that suit.
That then leads us to a conversation about standards, because one of the things that we often run into is you'll have Tanzanian farmers who tend to have a surplus, say in maize, for example, trying to export the produce across the border into Kenya, and the Kenyan authorities say, no, this doesn't meet this standard and this standard and this standard. And there's a lot of, we have this patchwork quilt of phytosanitary standards right across Africa. What do we need to do to get just one standard set right across, say, regional economic blocks? SADC has one standard, the East African Community has another one, and so on.
There are two kinds of standards that I've developed. One is a private sector managed standards, supermarkets-driven standard. And there's also the government side in terms of standards. So those two things are very, very important. But most important is how you help farmers to be able to meet what those standards are, regardless of what those standards are.
And common standards across regions
as well. But common standards are important because if you want to have regional integration, you can't have one standard here and another standard there. You know, it has to be quite unified. And I must say that the standards in East African communities is much better because the level of regional trade is actually much higher in East African community because of the more common standards that they are moving towards. And I think that should be encouraged.